The Sequoia had stood for 1,900 years before the storm brought it down. Marlowe Thorne found it the morning after hiking the southeast patrol route through a section of the park. Most of her colleagues had quietly stopped visiting. She had been up before 4. The way she was always up before 4 in October when the storms came through and needed checking on. She had driven the 20 minutes from her cabin to the trailhead in the pre-dawn dark, with the truck's heater running and the radio off. She did not need the radio to know what the storm had done. She could see it in the way the light came through the trees as the sky lightened. The gaps that had not been there before, the altered angles of shade and sun on the trail. The way the forest rearranged itself when something large came down and changed what the canopy let through. She had learned to read fallen things from a distance before she ever got close enough to see them directly. 11 years in these mountains had given her a specific way of seeing. The air smelled of broken wood, raw and pale green. The interior scent of something that had been sealed inside living tissue for centuries and was finally meeting open weather. The fallen giant stretched across the shallow ravine below its crown, buried somewhere deep in the understory on the far bank. Its massive root ball pulled clean from the earth and tilted at a sharp angle against the gray morning sky. The exposed roots spread 30 feet in every direction. A cathedral fan of tangled wood and black Sierra soil that still dripped with last night's rain. Water ran in thin copper lines down the underside of the root mass, pooling at the base of the excavation the tree had left behind. A crater-shaped depression 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide, its bottom soft with mud and bark debris and the slow accumulation of centuries. Marlowe stood at the edge of the bank, with her hands in her jacket pockets, and looked at it without moving. 11 years in these mountains had given her a specific way of seeing fallen things. The way they altered the light punched gaps in the canopy where the sky came through, left behind wounds in the forest floor that took decades to heal. This tree would have been a sapling when the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. It had outlasted the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age and 3 separate wildfires that Marlowe could document in the park's historical record. Whatever combination of forces had finally taken it down, the sustained winds that had come through after midnight, the root rot she had flagged in her inspection 2 summers back, the slow geological tilting of the soil along the eastern ridge had required the patience of something very close to geological time to accomplish what one October storm managed in a night. She was working out how to write it up in the incident log when she noticed something in the exposed depression that had no business being there. Marlowe Thorne had been the ranger assigned to Sector 7 of the Sequoia Kings Canyon backcountry for 11 years. Before her, her grandfather, Weston Thorne, had walked these same trails for 23. Sector 7 covered 412 acres of old-growth forest along the park's eastern boundary, the highest concentration of mature giant sequoias outside the main corridor groves. No one disputed that the trees were extraordinary. What people had been disputing with increasing force and institutional patience was whether Marlowe Thorne was the right person to be watching over them, or whether anyone needed to watch over them at all. The budget review in Sacramento had flagged Sector 7 as redundant coverage 8 months ago. The regional director, a man named Aldrich Calloway, who had spent most of his career in buildings that faced away from mountains, had submitted the recommendation in writing. Consolidate the eastern boundary patrol into the main grid. Redirect the funding to the western corridors where the visitor numbers justified it. Marlowe had attended the public comment hearing and spoken for 8 minutes. She brought photographs and erosion data and a breakdown of the poaching pressure she documented on the eastern approach over 3 years. She had made the case without drama. Calloway had thanked her for her time. The job posting for her position appeared on the Park Service internal board 3 weeks later. The notice cited budget constraints and organizational restructuring. It made no mention of Summit Timber Corporation, the logging company that had been filing regulatory comments about the eastern boundary easement for the better part of 2 years, or of the fact that Calloway had attended a conference in Reno 6 months ago that Summit had sponsored. Marlowe knew about the conference because her colleague Garrett Lockwood had told her in the parking lot after a staff meeting. His voice low and careful, in the way it always was when he was handing her information he could not afford to have traced back to him. Garrett had been doing this work for 16 years. He understood the difference between what you knew and what you could prove, and he was careful to stay on the right side of that line. Marlowe had written up the conflict of interest concern and submitted it to the district ethics office. She had not heard back. That was 4 months ago. Summit Timber was not a small operation. They had been logging the central Sierra Nevada range since the 1970s, and in the past decade, they had shifted their strategy from outright acquisition to what their regulatory filings called access rights clarification, a phrase that translated in practice to identifying boundary ambiguities in protected land and applying sustained legal and political pressure until someone in a position to clarify things did so in a way that benefited Summit. Garrett had explained the pattern to Marlowe over a year ago, pulling up examples on his laptop in the station break room with the careful, methodical manner of someone who had spent a long time watching this happen to other sectors before it started happening to theirs. In 2 previous cases on the western edge of the park system, Summit had used the same approach: regulatory comments, sponsored research, cultivated relationships with regional administrators. In both cases, the boundaries had shifted, not dramatically, just enough. What Summit wanted from Sector 7's eastern boundary specifically, Marlowe had never been entirely certain. The timber value of old-growth sequoia was legally negligible. You could not log them, and everyone knew it. But Summit's regulatory filings kept citing something Garrett called a historical access claim, language that referenced the boundary's original survey from the 1950s in ways that suggested they believed there was something about that survey worth contesting. Marlowe had read the filings 3 times and found them opaque, in the specific way legal documents are opaque when they are designed to obscure what they are actually claiming. She understood now, standing in the depression beside what she was about to discover, that the opacity might have been intentional. Since the ethics complaint, she had been doing what she always did, showing up before dawn and patrolling her sector, writing her reports, photographing her trees, maintaining a detailed log of every irregular thing she observed in 412 acres of old-growth forest that certain people in Sacramento had already decided was not worth watching over. She did it because the trees did not know about budget reviews and regulatory comments, and the slow procedural erosion of the systems meant to protect them. They were there as they had been there for centuries, and someone needed to keep track of what was happening to them. Her grandfather, Weston, had understood that in exactly the same way. Weston Thorne had retired from Sector 7 in 1998 when Marlowe was in college, and he had lived out his remaining years in a small house in Fresno with a shelf above the fireplace that held exactly 3 photographs. One was of Weston's wife, Eleanor, taken at their wedding in 1961. One was of Marlowe's father as a young man standing at the edge of a mountain lake. The third was of a man Weston never talked about directly. A black and white print edges softened with handling showing a figure in work clothes standing beside a massive rock formation with one hand resting on the stone. Weston would look at that photograph sometimes in a way that had no particular expression attached to it. Marlowe had asked about it as a girl, the way children ask about things that adults handle with unusual care. And Weston had said it was his father. And then he had changed the subject with the practiced ease of a man who had changed that subject many times over many years, Weston's father, Marlowe's great-grandfather, had been a miner. That was the family history assembled in fragments over the course of a childhood, spent in and out of Weston's house during summers and holidays. A miner named Caleb, who had worked the Sierra Nevada in the 1930s and disappeared sometime in the early 1940s, leaving Weston and his mother alone in Fresno. Weston never elaborated on what disappeared meant. Marlowe had understood as a child that it was the kind of word that stood in for harder words, and she had learned to leave it alone the way you leave a door alone that you have been shown is not meant to open. Weston had become a park ranger instead of a miner. He had spent his career watching over the same mountains his father had worked, walking the same ground in a different capacity, keeping a different kind of record. Marlowe had followed him into it without fully understanding why. Whether it was the work itself she had been drawn to, or the particular quality of unfinished business that Weston's silence about his father had left in the family's air, like a smell nobody quite named. She had never asked Weston directly. By the time Marlowe was old enough to ask the real questions, Weston's memory had softened at the edges, and the answers would not have been reliable anyway. Weston died in 2015. He left Marlowe a shoebox of photographs and the old patrol logs from his 23 years in Sector 7. Marlowe kept both. Caleb Thorne, a miner. The Sierra Nevada. That was all Marlowe had ever known. She was 41 years old, and her life had a particular shape she had stopped pretending was temporary. Her marriage had ended 2 years ago quietly and without cruelty. Her husband David had finally said what had been true for some time, that he had married a woman whose real home was 3 hours from the nearest city and whose phone went dead above 7,000 feet. And that he had waited long enough to see if that changed. It had not. She did not blame him. The mountains had not been fair to him, and she had known it and chosen them anyway. That was a kind of answer she had to sit with. Her brother Bennett lived in Fresno 20 minutes from where Weston had spent his last years, and he had been managing a kidney condition for 18 months that kept him in the specialist's office on a schedule that consumed money, the way a slow leak consumes a tank, steadily without drama until the gauge drops and the damage becomes visible. Marlowe sent him what she could each month. It was not enough. It was rarely enough, and it was getting less enough as the specialist visits grew more frequent. The job posting on the internal board represented something more immediate than a career shift. If the position was eliminated, she lost not just the work, but the salary that was currently the thinnest possible floor under her brother's situation. She had been thinking about all of this on the trail going in circles she had learned to recognize as the kind that led nowhere, when the fallen Sequoia pulled her attention completely, and everything else emptied out. She scrambled down the bank of the ravine to the base of the root ball. Up close, the root system was extraordinary, even by Sequoia standards. Cables of old wood as thick as her thigh, trailing long curtains of soil and stone, laced through with smaller roots that had been feeding this tree quietly since before any nation Marlowe had ever lived in was a concept someone had thought of. The root ball itself stood 12 feet high on its edge, and the depression it had left behind was genuinely profound. The shape of an absence that something enormous had occupied for a very long time. She was scanning the layers of exposed soil, reading the stratigraphy the way Weston had taught her to as a teenager, when she saw the hatch. Set in the wall of the depression approximately 4 feet below the original ground surface was a circular steel plate roughly 3 feet in diameter. It had a recessed pull handle and a concrete collar that had been poured carefully around its edges to seal it to the surrounding earth. The concrete was old, cracked, in places dark with long exposure to moisture, patched at some point along the way. The steel itself was heavy gauge, the kind that implied serious intention rather than temporary installation. And whatever coating had been applied to it at some point had held well enough that no significant rusting had penetrated to the plate's core. It sat in the wall of the exposed crater like something that had been waiting patient and sealed for whatever specific circumstance would finally bring it into the open. Marlowe stood very still and looked at it. She looked at it for a long time without moving closer. The forest around her was quiet, in the way forests are quiet in the hours after storms, everything listening to see what shifts next. A woodpecker worked somewhere in the middle distance. Rain dripped from the lower canopy in erratic drops that disturbed the surface of the pooled water. At the bottom of the depression, the hatch did nothing. It just sat there in its concrete collar, patient and sealed and entirely out of place in the raw geology of an exposed mountain root system. She pulled out her phone and took 3 photographs from where she stood, getting clear angles on the concrete collar, the handle, the surrounding soil layers. Then she climbed down into the depression. The ground at the bottom was soft mud and bark debris mixed with the organic material of centuries of accumulated forest floor, and it pulled at her boots as she crossed to the hatch. She crouched in front of it and studied the concrete work carefully. Whoever had done this pour had been deliberate about it. They had smoothed the seam where concrete met steel with skill, then come back and filled the shrinkage cracks with a second application. The collar extended about 8 inches above the soil line, which meant the installation had been done before the sequoia's root system had grown across and over it. She did a rough calculation in her head. If this tree was 1900 years old, and the roots had fully grown over the site, the installation could have been done any time from roughly the 1920s onward, when the tree's root mass was already well established at this depth, without significantly disturbing it. She pressed her palm flat against the steel plate, cold, faintly damp on the surface. No vibration, no air movement. Nothing suggesting the space below was communicating with the world above. Just the passive resistance of metal that had been sitting in one position for a long time and saw no reason to announce itself. You should have called it in. Any structural feature, any artifact or installation in a designated wilderness area required an incident report before personal investigation. That was standing protocol, and Marlowe had spent 11 years following protocol because she understood why it existed, and because breaking it without reason was how people got things wrong. She unclipped her radio and held it. Then she thought about Calloway's office. She thought about Summit Timber's regulatory filings on the eastern boundary easement. She thought about the sponsored conference in Reno and the ethics complaint that had gone unanswered for 4 months. Whatever was below this hatch, whatever had been sealed here long enough for a 2,000-year-old tree's root system to grow over it, was going to become someone else's business the moment she keyed her radio. And someone else's business in this specific institutional context meant Calloway's office. Calloway's office had a relationship with a logging company that had been working to strip this sector of its protected status for 2 years. She clipped the radio back to her belt. She pulled on her gloves. She took a photograph of the hatch from 3 feet, then from 1. She took a photograph of the serial number stamped into the steel near the handle's recess. She photographed the concrete collar from both sides. She was going to document everything, and she was not going to disturb anything she did not need to. And she was going to look first and decide what to report and to whom and in what order only after she understood what she was dealing with. The handle was spring-loaded, recessed flush against the plate. She worked her fingers under the lip, feeling the mechanism, and pulled upward. The handle swung up and locked. She gripped it with both hands and pulled. Nothing. The plate had no interest in moving. She repositioned, getting her legs under her, using the leverage of her back and thighs, rather than just her arms. She pulled steadily, increasing pressure, rather than jerking. For a full 20 seconds, nothing happened. Then something gave. Not the hatch itself, but the gasket seal around its edge. A rubber compression seal that had been doing its job for decades, finally releasing its grip under sustained force. The plate came up with a sound like a slow exhalation, deep and pressurized, followed immediately by a draft of cold air rising from the space below. Marlowe sat back on her heels and held still. The air coming up from the shaft was cold in a way that went beyond the ambient temperature of the mountain morning. It was the cold of sealed space, dry and still, and carrying none of the organic smell of living soil. The closest thing she could compare it to was the air inside old stone buildings, the kind that had been kept closed for seasons at a time, The smell was mineral and ancient and entirely without moisture, which meant wherever the space connected to it was either far enough from the water table to stay dry, or it had been sealed well enough to keep water out for a long time. She pointed her flashlight down. The shaft was lined with concrete block carefully laid. A steel ladder with rungs set into the block on one side descended into the dark below. Her flashlight beam reached about 15 feet before the shaft curved slightly, and the angle was lost. She leaned in and looked as far down as she could, listening. Nothing moved below. No drip of water, no sound of settling stone. Nothing suggesting the space was live or occupied, or in any way dangerous in an immediate sense. She checked the top rung. It was flecked with surface rust, but the bolt mounting was solid. She could see it was set with expansion anchors driven into the concrete block, the kind of installation done by someone who intended the ladder to be used repeatedly and safely. She put her weight on the first rung. No flex, no movement. She put her weight on the second. The same. She took a breath of the dry, cold air rising from below and descended. 12 rungs, approximately 15 feet. The block-lined shaft gave way at the bottom to rough-cut granite, actual stone hand-worked. The marks of steel tools still faintly visible in the grain of the rock. The shaft opened into a low horizontal passage, the ceiling clearing her head by perhaps 3 inches when she stood straight. The floor was compacted earth, dry as sawdust, undisturbed by anything she could see. The air at this level was colder than the shaft and completely still. She turned the flashlight down the passage and followed it. The passage ran 32 paces before it opened. She stepped through the entry and stopped. The chamber was larger than anything the passage had prepared her for, roughly 20 feet wide and 15 deep, with a ceiling of granite blocks and heavy timber beams that had been placed with the care of someone who understood load distribution and wanted this space to outlast them. The walls were rough granite dry, showing none of the seepage or mineral deposition that would indicate water infiltration. The timber beams showed no rot, no insect damage, nothing suggesting compromise. Whoever had built this room had built it to last, and it had. Marlowe moved the flashlight beam slowly around the space, taking it all in before she moved. The walls on 3 sides were lined with shelves. Heavy timber braced against the stone with iron brackets that had surface rust but were structurally sound. The shelves held wooden crates arranged in rows, some stacked 2 deep, some standing alone. The crates were old, the wood darkened with age and the particular density that comes from decades of compression and cold. The hardware, hinges, clasps, rope handles was tarnished but intact. Nothing had moved. Nothing had been disturbed. The arrangement had the quality of a room that had been deliberately organized and then sealed every object in the position its owner had chosen for it. At the center of the room stood a wooden workbench, its legs set into the earthen floor with the permanence of something installed rather than placed. On the bench, a kerosene lantern, the fuel long since gone, the glass chimney intact and clear. A tin cup, a folded cloth that had stiffened with age to the texture of old leather. And at the center of the bench, positioned with the deliberate care of an object set down by someone who expected to return for it, was a journal. Leather bound, its cover plain and brown and dark at the edges. Marlowe stood in the middle of the chamber and turned slowly, looking at everything, breathing the cold mineral air, and felt something she had not felt in quite some time. Not excitement. That word was too small and too unserious for what was pressing against her chest. Something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of an understanding that was too large to take in all at once. She crossed to the nearest row of crates and studied them without touching. Pine construction, dovetailed corners, fitted lids secured with wire clasps. No markings on most of them. She worked along the row flashlight, moving across each one in sequence. At the end of the row was a larger crate, broader, with rope handles on the sides, and burned into the wood on its face was a series of marks and a date. She walked the perimeter of the room, counting. She counted the crates twice to make sure. 27 in total, distributed across 3 shelving runs, ranging in size from the small clasped ones to the larger dated one. Whatever they held, they had been packed carefully and stored with the expectation of retrieval. She came back to the center of the room and stood in front of the workbench. The journal sat where it had sat for decades, at the center, waiting. She looked at it without touching it for a long moment. Then she crossed to the nearest small crate and worked the wire clasp with careful fingers. The lid lifted with the soft resistance of old wood that had settled into its closed position for a very long time. She moved the flashlight beam inside. The crate was packed with burlap cloth brown with age, wrapped around a central object in careful layers. She lifted the outer edge of the burlap and folded it back. Her movement slow and precise. Her flashlight hit metal, dense, warm yellow metal that caught the beam and returned it with the specific depth and richness that distinguishes actual gold from every substance that merely resembles it from a distance. She was looking at bars, 2 of them side by side, each one roughly the dimensions of a thick hardback book. Each bar was stamped on its face with a serial number and a year. Marlowe put her hand on the nearest bar and held it there. The metal was cold and heavy in a way that felt almost geological, the compressed weight of something reduced to its densest form. She picked it up. It was heavier than she had braced for, not because she did not know what gold weighed. She knew what gold weighed, and it was heavy because the act of picking it up made real something that her brain had been processing as abstract for the 30 seconds since she had pulled back the burlap. She was holding a gold bar in a sealed underground vault beneath a 2,000-year-old sequoia tree in a section of national forest that a logging company had been quietly working to declassify for 2 years. She set the bar back down with care, replaced the burlap layers, and closed the lid. She stood up and looked at the 27 crates for a long moment. She was aware that her breathing had changed. She was aware that the cold air of the vault felt different against her face than it had when she had first stepped in. The same temperature, the same mineral stillness, but carrying a different weight now. The crates were no longer a collection of old boxes on shelves in a sealed underground room. They were the physical record of years of a man's labor converted into the densest possible form and buried in the dark for safekeeping. She opened 2 more crates. Both held the same contents. 2 bars, each wrapped in burlap, dated. One read 1935. One read 1937. She photographed both before reclosing. She did not open any more. She did not need to know the exact count tonight, and she did not want to disturb the arrangement more than she already had. Whatever was in the other crates would still be there. Whatever had been sealed in this room for 83 years was not going anywhere before Marlowe figured out what she was looking at and what she intended to do about it. She took photographs of every crate face, the wire clasps, the rope handles, the date burned into the large crate at the end of the row. She photographed the shelving from the entry point, showing the room's full depth. She photographed the ceiling beams, the floor, the passage entrance. She was building a record the way her grandfather Weston had built records. Then she walked to the far end of the room. Along the back wall, partially obscured by the last shelf unit, was a recess cut directly into the granite. A natural fissure that had been widened and shaped with tools roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. It was covered with a piece of canvas that had been folded and pressed against the rock. The fabric stiffened with age into something close to cardboard. She pulled the canvas back. Behind it was a shelf carved into the stone itself, and on the shelf sat a small collection of objects arranged with deliberate care. A rolled document tied with linen twine that had gone stiff. A flat tin box with a hinged clasp. And a framed photograph, the glass intact, showing a man in work clothes standing in bright, direct sunlight beside a large granite formation. The man had one hand resting on the stone with the easy familiarity of someone who knew this particular rock in the way you know a place you have returned to many times. Marlowe picked up the photograph and held her flashlight close to it. The man's face was partly in the shadow of a hat brim, but his posture, the way he stood with one knee slightly bent, his weight on his back foot, a quality of stillness in the way he occupied the frame triggered something in Marlowe's memory with the force of recognition rather than discovery. She had seen this posture in photographs before, in a shoebox in her grandfather Weston's house in Fresno. In the photograph Weston kept on the shelf above the fireplace, the one he never explained, Marlowe stood very still with the photograph in her hands. She set it back on the shelf exactly as she had found it. She picked up the rolled document and examined it without untying the twine. The paper at the outer edge of the roll was stiff and deeply brown but unbroken. Whoever had chosen this paper had chosen it for longevity. She could read partial text at the document's outer edge where the roll ended. The words that were visible before the document, curved away, were Sierra Nevada Land Company and Land Patent, and the name Thorne Caleb. She held her flashlight as close as she could, without disturbing the roll, trying to read every word visible at the edge. The partial text also showed what appeared to be a legal parcel description. Coordinates and section markers in a line of acreage that, as far as she could tell from the fragment, described several hundred acres of land on the eastern boundary of what was now the Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, what was now Sector 7. She photographed the document's exposed edge from multiple angles, moving carefully to capture every visible word without unrolling it. Then she set it back and picked up the tin box. The clasp was stiff but functional. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them against the dry air, were 3 items. A newspaper clipping folded once, a handwritten note on torn brown paper, and a letter folded in thirds addressed on the outside fold in careful script. For Wesley when he is old enough. Wesley. Weston's given name, the one he never used. The one Marlowe had seen only on official documents and his headstone. She photographed each item where it lay, then carefully removed the letter. The paper was thick, chosen for durability. The handwriting was deliberate, each line straight and measured. She read it standing in the cold vault beneath the October forest. Her flashlight trained on words that had been written 83 years ago by a man she had never met, addressed to a grandfather who had died without knowing any of this existed. The letter began without preamble. Wesley, if you are reading this, you found the vault. That means you are old enough to understand what I am going to tell you. And I am not there to tell you in person, which means things went the way I was afraid they might go. The land patent I filed in 1936 is real. The transfer you might have heard about, the one the land office in Sacramento says went through in November 1941, is fraudulent. I did not sign it. I did not agree to it. I received no money for it. Someone at the Sierra Nevada Land Company forged my name and paid someone in the county clerk's office to process it. I went to Sacramento to contest it and was told the paperwork was in order. It was not in order. The original patent documents are in this box with the note and this letter. They show my filing my name, the correct parcel boundaries, and the date. These are the real papers. Whatever transfer documents exist in the county records are forgeries. A lawyer who knows land law should be able to prove this if you bring him the originals. The gold in the crates is yours. I worked that vein for 7 years and I kept clean records. The assay records are in the journal. A lawyer can help you with the tax situation. I do not know exactly what the rules will be when you read this, but the gold was worked legally and stored legally, and it belongs to the Thorne family. I want to tell you things a father is supposed to tell a son in person over years, not in a letter that might sit in a box for God knows how long. I want to tell you that you have good instincts, and you should trust them. That the mountains are honest in a way that people are not always honest, and that spending time in them will give you something that protects you from the dishonest parts of people. That your mother, Eleanor, is the best person I ever knew, and you got her stubbornness, which will serve you better than any inheritance I can leave. I do not know what happened to me. If you are reading this, I hope it was natural. I do not think it will be. Fight for the land, Wesley. Not because land is the most important thing. It is not. Fight for it because someone took it from us, and taking things that do not belong to you is wrong, and wrong things do not stop being wrong just because they go unanswered for a long time. The mountain keeps its own. Your father, Caleb. Marlowe stood in the vault and read the letter twice. The cold pressed against her face. The silence of the chamber held steady around her. Above her 15 feet of granite and mountain, and 2,000 years of fallen tree, and in her hands the careful record of a man who had built something real and hidden it carefully, and sealed his trust in it against the possibility of his own absence. And then disappeared, leaving a son in Fresno who grew up to be a forest ranger and walked these trails for 23 years and never once looked beneath the oldest trees on the eastern boundary. Weston never came. Not because Weston had chosen not to come, because Weston had never known. Because Caleb had sealed this vault in October 1941. And then Marlo did not know what had happened next. She did not know what disappeared meant in the context of her family's careful silence. She had always understood it to mean something ordinary. A man who left and did not come back. A miner who moved on. The kind of absent father story that had too many versions to investigate. She was no longer certain it meant anything ordinary. She photographed the letter from multiple angles, capturing every word. She photographed the newspaper clipping without unfolding it. She photographed the note. Then she returned everything to the tin box exactly as she had found it, and placed the box back on the stone shelf. She stood in the center of the vault and turned slowly, looking at the shelves, the crates, the workbench, the alcove. She had been underground for 40 minutes. The October morning above would be full light by now. The forest settling into its daylight rhythms. Birds moving through the understory. The sound of water running in the distance. She walked back through the passage to the ladder and climbed. The surface air felt abrasive after the sealed dark below. She stood at the edge of the excavation, with her eyes adjusting and her mind working in a way that felt less like thinking and more like watching something assemble itself without her help. 27 crates. Gold bars dated 1934 to 1938. A land patent filed by her great-grandfather, Caleb Thorne, on 412 acres in 1936. Evidence that the patent had been fraudulently transferred out of Caleb's name in 1941. And a logging company that had been spending the past 2 years very quietly trying to acquire rights over the eastern boundary easement of what was currently Sector 7 of the Sequoia Kings Canyon backcountry. 412 acres. The same 412 acres that Marlo had been patrolling for 11 years. The same 412 acres that Callaway's office had classified as redundant coverage and posted for elimination. She reached down and pulled the hatch closed. The seal reseated with the same slow exhalation as before reversed. She brushed loose soil over the concrete collar until it looked like exposed earth, among the rest of the exposed earth in the depression. She took a final photograph of the area, checked her GPS coordinates, and climbed back up the bank of the ravine. The fallen sequoia stretched across the ravine behind her, enormous and still its great length disappearing into the understory. A tree that had kept this secret for 80 years, longer than her grandfather's entire life. A tree that had grown 30 feet tall, and then 60 feet, and then 100, while Caleb Thorne built the vault below its roots, and had gone on growing after Caleb was gone, and had stood through Weston's entire career as a ranger, and had finally come down in one storm on a night when Marlo was the one on patrol, and no one else was on this trail. She stood on the lip of the excavation and thought about probability for a moment. What it meant that the tree had stood for exactly as long as it needed to stand and come down at exactly the moment it had. She was not by nature a woman who read significance into coincidence. 11 years of fieldwork had given her a healthy skepticism about the stories people told to make events feel less random. Trees fell for geological reasons, not narrative ones. But the geological reasons had aligned in a specific way, on a specific night to reveal something specific. And Marlowe was the one who had walked the trail before anyone else could see it. She was the one who knew what Sector 7 was and what it meant to her family, and what forces had been working for 2 years to strip it of the protection that was it now appeared the only thing standing between 412 acres of patented thornland and a logging company that had been circling it with the patience of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. 27 crates, gold bars dated 1934 to 1938. She pulled out her phone and looked at the contact. She had not called in 3 years. Garrett Lockwood. He picked up on the second ring, his voice cautious in the way it always was when he did not know what he was walking into. Marlowe, you are out early. I need to talk to you. Not at the station. Not on the radio. A pause. That specific. That specific. A shorter pause. She could hear him breathing in the silence, calculating. Garrett Lockwood had been doing this work for 16 years, and he had stayed employed by knowing when to ask questions and when to just respond to the information he was being given. There is a diner in 3 Rivers, off the main road past the hardware store. I can be there at noon. I will be there. She put the phone away and started walking. The trail was familiar under her boots in the way things are familiar when you have walked them hundreds of times. The specific lean of the switchback at the first ridge. The place where the trail dipped close to the creek and the ground stayed soft even in dry months. The clearing at 4 miles where the view opened west toward the valley and the mountains dropped away into a distance so clear it looked invented. She had walked this in every season, in fog and ice and the flat heat of August, and she had never once thought about what was underneath the ground. She thought about it now. She thought about her grandfather Weston walking these same 6 miles for 23 years, watching the trees grow imperceptibly older, logging his observations in the same careful way Caleb had logged the contents of the vault below. 2 thorn men separated by 50 years, and 1 layer of mountain, both keeping track of the same 400 acres of old-growth forest, both writing it down, one never knowing what the other had written. She thought about the shoebox in Weston's house in Fresno, the 3 photographs on the shelf above the fireplace, the particular silence Weston kept around the subject of his father. Marlowe had always understood that silence as the ordinary grief of an abandoned child, the reasonable protective withdrawal of a man who had taught himself not to expect things from a father who left and did not come back. She understood it differently now, not as a man avoiding old pain, but as a man who had never been given the information he needed to grieve properly, who had grown up carrying the absence of an explanation for the most important loss of his childhood, who had taken a job walking the same ground his father had walked, without ever knowing why that ground had mattered so much, or what it had cost, Weston had spent 23 years as close to this vault as the length of a hiking trail. He had retired in 1998. He died in 2015 in a house in Fresno with 3 photographs on the shelf. He had never known. Marlo stopped walking for a moment. She stood on the trail in the October light and breathed and tried to hold that fact without letting it break her concentration. Weston had never known. Caleb had left the vault for his son, had written the instructions carefully and sealed them in the dark, and Weston had walked the ground for 23 years and never looked under it. Whether Caleb had disappeared before he could tell Weston where to look, or whether something had prevented the information from ever reaching Weston, Marlo did not know yet. She needed to know. Before she understood the full shape of what she was holding, she needed to understand what had happened to Caleb Thorne in the weeks and months after that final journal entry in October 1941. She thought about her brother Bennett and the specialist bills and the posting on the internal board. She thought about Summit Timber's regulatory filings and their specific language about historical access claims on the eastern boundary easement. Language she had found opaque on 3 readings and now found perfectly transparent. They knew about the patent anomaly. They knew the 1936 filing existed. They had been working the regulatory angle because they believed the land could eventually be reclassified if the protected status was stripped and the historical claim came back into play. They just did not know that the original patent documentation was still here. They did not know about the vault or the journal, or the 27 crates of physical evidence that someone had taken this land without legal right. Or they had not known until a storm came through last night and dropped a 2,000-year-old tree on the most important evidence in a century-old theft. The diner in 3 Rivers would have coffee and a corner table, and Garrett Lockwood, who had 16 years of institutional knowledge and a specific kind of careful intelligence that knew which questions were worth asking out loud. She had photographs on her phone. She had the letter's final lines memorized. She had the partial text of a land patent document in a sealed alcove in a tin box she had not fully opened, and a photograph of a man who stood the same way her grandfather stood in the photograph on the shelf above the fireplace. She had 11 years of patrol logs, every observation, every report, every photograph of the oldest trees on the eastern boundary. Trees that had been growing here when Caleb Thorne discovered what was underneath them and decided to protect it for the son he was about to lose his ability to reach. She had the GPS coordinates of the hatch. She walked the last mile faster than she had walked any of the others, her boots finding the trail without needing her to think about where to put them. The mountains did that for you after enough years. Took over the physical work of moving through them so your mind could do something else. Her mind was doing a great deal else. She reached her truck as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She sat in the cab with the engine running and the heater on and looked at the mountains in the rearview mirror. The same mountains her grandfather had looked at every morning for 23 years. The same mountains Caleb had worked alone before, that digging a vein by lamplight and converting what he found into bars of dense yellow metal, and sealing it all in granite darkness against a future he would not live to see. The mountain keeps its own. It had kept this for 83 years. kept it through storms and fires and the slow institutional erosion of everything that was supposed to protect it. Kept it while one company after another waited for the right moment to take what was not theirs. And while 2 generations of Thorne family members walked the ground above without knowing what was underneath. Now Marlowe was going to make sure that what it had kept would finally go to the right place. She drove the 20 minutes back to her cabin in silence. She did not turn on the radio. She did not need the radio to know what she had found, or what it meant, or what came next. She parked outside the cabin and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel looking at the forest through the windshield. The same forest she looked at every morning. The same trees. The same light coming through the canopy in the way it always came through. Everything the same. Everything different. She went inside and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with her phone and went through every photograph she had taken in the vault. She went through them twice, then a third time, and then she opened her laptop and began uploading them to a secure cloud server with timestamps and metadata intact. While the files uploaded, she opened the tin box she had brought from the vault, the newspaper clipping, the handwritten note, the letter addressed to Wesley. She unfolded the newspaper clipping carefully. The masthead read, Visalia Delta, dated November 18, 1941. The headline on the clipped article read, Miner Found Dead on Eastern Sierra Slope Coroner Rules Accidental Fall. The article was 7 paragraphs. She read it standing at her kitchen counter with her coffee going cold in her hand. Caleb Emmett Thorne, 44, of no fixed address, had been found at the base of a granite outcropping in the Sierra Nevada foothills east of Visalia on November 12, 1941. Cause of death was ruled blunt trauma, consistent with a fall from height. No foul play was suspected. The coroner's office noted that solo mining operations in remote terrain carried inherent risk. Thorne was survived by a son, Wesley, age 9, of Fresno. 6 weeks. 6 weeks after Caleb had written that final journal entry about being done fighting in rooms that had already been bought. Marlowe set the clipping down and picked up the handwritten note. The paper was torn from a larger sheet, the edge ragged. The handwriting was not Caleb's. It was hurried and cramped where Caleb's was careful and deliberate. It read, They know about the cabin. Do not go back. Someone from the company followed you from Sacramento. Get out of the mountains until this is settled. W. No surname, no date, no way to know whether Caleb had received this warning in time or whether it had arrived the same week as the coroner's ruling. She photographed both documents and uploaded them to the server. Then she put everything back in the tin box and locked it in the small safe she kept in her bedroom closet. She had 3 hours before she was supposed to meet Garrett Lockwood in 3 Rivers. She spent 2 of those hours going through Weston's old patrol logs, the ones he had kept in the filing cabinet in his garage for 23 years, and given to Marlowe the year before he died. She was looking for anything, any mention of the eastern boundary, any note about unusual geological features, or historical installations or places where the ground looked disturbed. She found nothing. Weston had been meticulous in his documentation, but he had documented the surface, The trees, the trails, the weather patterns, the animal populations. He had walked over Caleb's vault for 23 years and written down everything except the one thing that mattered, because he had not known to look. She closed the last log and sat with her hands flat on the table and thought about her grandfather, walking the same ground she walked, carrying the same name she carried, doing the same work she did, and never once knowing that 15 feet below the oldest sequoia on the eastern ridge was a letter addressed to him from a father who had tried to leave him something real. The diner was half full when she arrived. Garrett was already there, sitting in the corner booth with a cup of coffee and the careful posture of someone who had arrived early to assess the room before the meeting started. She slid into the booth across from him and did not waste time. "I found something." He looked at her face and something in his expression shifted. "Show me." She put her phone on the table and opened the photographs. She started from the beginning. The hatch in the wall of the excavation. The shaft. The ladder. The passage. The chamber. The rows of crates. The workbench. When she got to the photographs of the gold bars, Garrett put his hand over his mouth. She kept going. The alcove, the photograph of Caleb Thorne, the land patent document's exposed edge, the journal's first page, then the last. She let him read the final entry twice, watching his face. He read it the way people read things that are rewriting something they thought they understood. Not quickly, not performing reaction, but with the slow care of someone making sure the words mean what they appear to mean. He looked up. "Caleb Thorne, your great-grandfather, Weston's father." She nodded. Who was the ranger in Sector 7 for 23 years and never knew this was under his feet? Garrett looked back at the screen. He scrolled slowly through the images, going back to the land patent text at the edge of the rolled document. He was quiet for long enough that the waitress came and refilled his coffee and left again without either of them noticing. "Summit's regulatory filings," he said finally. "The historical access claim language. That is what I need you to tell me about." He set the phone down. "I pulled those filings 14 months ago when Callaway first started the redundancy review. There is a section that references a 1936 Sierra Nevada Land Company dispute over the eastern boundary parcel. I assumed it was a dead letter, something from the pre-park era that had been legally extinguished when the boundary was established. It happens. Old claims, old disputes, historical record noise." He paused. "I did not look at it closely because it seemed irrelevant." "It is not irrelevant. No." Marlowe leaned forward. "If that patent was never legally transferred, if what Caleb wrote in the journal is accurate and the 1941 transfer was fraudulent, then the eastern boundary of Sector 7 was drawn over privately patented land without extinguishing the original claim, which means the land the Park Service has been administering as federal wilderness for 70 years was never legally federal wilderness, which means I need a land attorney before I need anything else." Garrett pulled a pen from his jacket and wrote a name and number on a paper napkin. "Vivian Ashford. She is in Fresno. She handles historical land disputes, and she has a background in federal property law. Do not call her from your station phone. Do not put any of this in your patrol log yet. Marlowe took the napkin. And Calloway. Garrett's expression went careful, in the way it went careful when he was about to say something he could not take back. Calloway has been asking about your recent patrol activities. Nothing formal. He asked your sector's log coordinator what routes you had been running this week. He held her gaze. He asked yesterday afternoon. The storm had come through the night before. Someone had already flagged her patrol activity within 24 hours of the tree coming down. Marlowe folded the napkin and put it in her pocket. Before I drive to Fresno, I am going back to the vault. Garrett did not ask why. He understood that what Caleb had left behind was not just evidence. It was a record that needed to be read in full before anyone else knew it existed. Be careful. If Summit knows about the site, they are closer than you think. She drove back to the mountains through the October afternoon. The light was low enough that it threw long shadows across the road. The aspen along the highway were gold against the dark green of the pines. The sky was the deep blue that only happened at elevation after a storm had cleared. She parked at the trailhead and hiked back to the fallen Sequoia. The depression looked the same as it had that morning. The exposed root ball, the raw soil, the hatch buried under the loose earth she had scattered over it. She brushed the soil aside and opened the hatch again. The same cold exhalation of air, the same mineral smell. She descended the ladder and walked through the passage to the chamber. Everything was as she had left it. The crates undisturbed, the journal on the workbench, the alcove sealed behind its canvas cover. She crossed to the tin box and opened it again. This time she removed the letter and the documents and studied them under her flashlight with the deliberate attention of someone who understood she was holding the only proof that would stand up in court. She photographed every page of the letter, every line of the patent document she could see without unrolling it. She photographed the newspaper clipping from both sides. She photographed the handwritten warning note. Then she put everything back exactly as it had been and stood in the center of the vault for a long moment, looking at the shelves and the crates and the workbench where Caleb Thorne had sat 83 years ago and written his last words to a son he would never see again. The mountain keeps its own. She climbed back to the surface and sealed the hatch. The forest around her was settling into evening, the light going amber through the trees, the temperature dropping. She could see her breath. She stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at the mountains to the east. The same mountains Caleb had looked at. The same mountains Weston had looked at. The same mountains she looked at every day and would keep looking at for as long as someone needed to watch over them. She walked back to her truck as the last light faded from the sky. She drove home through the dark with the heater running and the windows cracked to let in the cold mountain air. When she got to her cabin, there was a voicemail on her phone from a number she did not recognize. She played it standing in her kitchen with her jacket still on. "Miss Thorne, this is Vivian Ashford. Garrett Lockwood called me this afternoon and gave me a brief outline of your situation. I would like to meet with you as soon as possible. Please call me at this number to set up a time." Marlowe saved the message and looked at the clock. 7:30. Too late to call tonight. She would call first thing in the morning. She made herself dinner and sat at her kitchen table with Weston's patrol logs spread out in front of her, reading them again, even though she knew she would not find what she was looking for. She was looking for some sign that Weston had suspected, some notation that suggested he had wondered about his father, or the land, or what might be hidden in the places he walked every day. There was nothing, just the steady accumulation of observations, weather patterns and tree health and trail conditions, and the slow passage of seasons across 412 acres of forest that Weston had loved without knowing why it should have been his. She closed the logs and sat in the quiet of her cabin and thought about the letter Caleb had written, the careful words, the instructions, the hope that Wesley would find it and use it and fight for what had been taken. Wesley had never found it, but Marlowe had, and she was going to finish what Caleb started. She went to bed late and woke early the way she always did. The October morning was cold and clear. She made coffee and called Vivian Ashford at 8. The lawyer answered on the second ring. "Miss Thorne, thank you for calling. Garrett told me you found something significant. I found a vault under a fallen sequoia. It contains evidence that my great-grandfather held a valid land patent on 412 acres that was fraudulently transferred in 1941. A pause, not shock. Calculation. How much evidence? Photographs of 27 crates of gold bars. A journal covering 7 years of mining operations. Original patent documents. A letter from my great-grandfather to my grandfather explaining the fraud. And a newspaper clipping about my great-grandfather's death 6 weeks after he wrote about the fraud. Another pause, longer this time. Can you be in my office at 2 this afternoon? Yes. Bring everything you have. Do not discuss this with anyone at your workplace. Do not file any reports about the site. Not yet. Understood. Ms. Thorne, if what you are describing is accurate, you are not just sitting on a land claim. You are sitting on evidence of an ongoing crime. Marlowe looked out her kitchen window at the mountains. I know. She drove to Fresno through the late morning. The highway dropped from the high country into the valley in a series of switchbacks that gave long views of the flat agricultural land below, the mountains behind her, the valley ahead, the specific geography of a life spent moving between two worlds that did not quite touch. Vivian Ashford's office was in a converted Victorian in downtown Fresno, the kind of building that had been a house once and still looked like a house from the outside, but had been divided into professional spaces that smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee. The lawyer was waiting in a second-floor office with bookshelves that covered 2 walls and certificates on the third. She was 58 trim, with the quality of attention of someone who had spent 30 years in courtrooms where details determined outcomes. She greeted Marlowe without ceremony and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Show me what you have." Marlowe handed over her phone. Vivian went through the images in silence, her face still. She was not a person who performed reactions while processing information. She looked at the first photograph of the journal page and stopped. She read it. She looked at the final entry photograph and read it twice. She went back and forth between images for several minutes, occasionally zooming in on specific details. When she set the phone down, her expression had the quality of someone who had looked at a great many situations in their career and was placing this one accurately in the range. You have the original patent documents. Marlowe put the tin box on the desk. In here, along with the letter my great-grandfather wrote to my grandfather, and the newspaper clipping about his death. Vivian opened the box with the care of someone who handled historical documents regularly. She unfolded the patent papers and read them slowly, turning pages examining the stamps and signatures. These are original filings. The paper, the stamp type, the ink, all consistent with 1930s County Land Office procedures. I will need an authentication expert to confirm formally, but these look genuine. She set them flat on the desk. And you said a fraudulent transfer document was filed in 1941. That is what Caleb wrote in the journal. His challenge to the transfer was denied. The county records from 1941 would still exist in the state archive. If there is a recorded transfer on file and we can show it was executed without Caleb Thorne's signature, we have the foundation of a fraud claim. She paused. The statute of limitations on land fraud in California is complex, but there are established precedents for cases involving forgery of original title documents. The fraud does not expire simply because the fraudster is dead and the victim is dead. What about the gold? Vivian looked at her notes. 27 crates. 2 bars per crate based on the 2 you opened. Approximate weight per bar. About 12 kilograms each. Maybe a bit more. She did the calculation on a notepad. Roughly 650 kilograms per crate pair. Call it 1,300 kilograms total. Approximately 2,900 pounds of gold. She said it the way she had said everything, factually, without drama. At current spot prices, that is in the range of $90 to $100 million. Marlowe sat with that number for a moment. She had known the gold was valuable. She had not done the math. I underestimated the bar weight, Vivian continued. We will have a formal assay done before any figure is used in proceedings. The bars may not all be identical in weight or purity, but we are working with a significant floor number, regardless of the variance. She looked at Marlowe steadily. Gold found in a structure on privately owned land, if the land claim is validated, belongs to the landowner under California property law. There are estate processing considerations and capital gains obligations. We will want a tax specialist involved from the beginning, but structurally the gold is yours. Marlowe looked out the window at downtown Fresno. The buildings, the traffic, the ordinary afternoon of a city that did not know what had just been said in this office. What is the land worth? 412 acres of old-growth Sierra Nevada with established mineral rights and documented timber value. Vivian exhaled slowly. The mineral vein Caleb documented would need a geological assessment. I cannot give you a land appraisal without a formal process. But conservation easement value alone what a land trust or federal entity would pay to acquire. It legitimately starts at $40 million and goes up depending on the mineral assessment. She looked at Marlowe with the same steady regard. Combined with the gold, you are looking at a total estate potentially north of $150 million. Marlowe thought about her brother Bennett in Fresno, the specialist appointments, the bills that kept coming, the particular mathematics of a situation that consumed money faster than either of them could produce it. She thought about the job posting on the internal board, the 8 months until her position was eliminated, the salary that was currently the only thing keeping Bennett's medical situation from collapsing entirely. She thought about Caleb Thorne sitting in a vault by lamplight, writing a letter to a son who would never read it. But Ms. Thorne Vivian said, the more immediate issue is not the money. Marlowe waited. The more immediate issue is that Summit Timber has been filing regulatory comments about this boundary for 2 years, using language that suggests they know. The 1936 patent dispute exists in the historical record. If they have been quietly building a case to contest the federal boundary, they may be further along than you realize. She leaned forward slightly. How much time do you have before Calloway moves forward with whatever he is planning? I do not know, but Garrett thinks he has already started. Then we file first. Emergency motion to preserve the vault site under California historical preservation statutes while the land claim is under review. That gets us a legal hold that prevents anyone from accessing or disturbing the site without court approval. She picked up her pen. And we submit the original patent documents to the state archive for authentication before anyone can contest their chain of custody. Marlowe nodded. One more thing, Vivian said. The letter from your great-grandfather. The one addressed to Wesley. That is personal property with no bearing on the legal case. But I want you to understand what it represents in terms of lineage documentation. If we need to establish that you are a direct Thorne descendant, with standing to bring this claim, that letter combined with birth records establishes continuity. Marlowe thought about Weston reading those words, about the 83 years the letter had waited. I understand. She drove back to the mountains in the last of the afternoon light. The valley behind her, the high country ahead, the road climbing through foothill oak and then pine, and then the big trees that marked the transition into the Sequoia belt. She thought about what Vivian had said. $150 million. The number sat in her mind like something she could not quite bring into focus. Too large to process as anything other than abstraction. What felt real was simpler. Bennett's medical bills covered. The job posting irrelevant. The land secured. The vault protected. Caleb's record validated. Weston's name cleared of the silence that had surrounded his father's disappearance for 83 years. That felt real. She pulled into her driveway as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. The cabin dark. The forest around it settling into evening. She sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off and looked at the trees through the windshield. Tomorrow, Vivian would file the preservation motion. Tomorrow, the vault would become a matter of public record. Tomorrow, Summit Timber and Aldrich Calloway would find out that the land they had been quietly working to acquire had just opened up and shown someone exactly what it was worth. But tonight, the secret was still hers. Tonight, the mountain still kept what it had been keeping for 83 years. Tonight, she was the only living person who knew that 15 feet below the oldest sequoia on the eastern boundary was a letter from a father to a son, and a record of a theft, and 27 crates of gold that had been waiting all this time for the right person to find them. She got out of the truck and walked to the edge of her property where the forest started. She could not see the trail from here, could not see the fallen sequoia, or the depression, or the hatch sealed under its layer of mountain soil. But she knew it was there, the same way Caleb had known it was there when he sealed it, the same way Weston should have known, but never did. She stood in the October cold and looked at the darkening forest and thought about what came next. The legal process, the authentication, the preservation order, the claim filed in county court, the response from Summit, the discovery phase, the forensics, the settlement or the trial, the months or years it would take to resolve a dispute that had been waiting since 1941 to be properly heard. All of that was coming, but it had not arrived yet. She went inside and made tea and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop. She opened a new document and began typing. Not a legal brief, not an incident report, just a record. The way Caleb had kept a record, the way Weston had kept a record. She wrote down everything that had happened from the moment she first saw the hatch to the moment Vivian Ashford had said the word continuity. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she saved the file with a timestamp and uploaded it to the same secure server where the photographs lived. Then she opened her email and wrote a message to her brother Bennett. Bennett, I need to see you tomorrow. Can you meet me in Fresno at noon? I have something to tell you. It is good. I promise. Marlo. She sent the message and closed the laptop. Outside, the night was full dark. The stars were out above the ridge, cold and numerous and entirely indifferent to anything that had happened in the forest below them. They would still be there tomorrow. They would be there when the legal process started, and when it ended, and when whatever came after that began. Marlo sat in her cabin and drank her tea and thought about Caleb Thorne one more time, a man who had worked alone in the mountains for 7 years, who had converted what he found into gold and sealed it in granite darkness, who had written careful instructions for a son he would not live to see grow up, who had fought the theft in rooms that had already been bought and lost and known he was going to lose, and left the truth somewhere it could survive anyway. The mountain keeps its own. It had kept this. And now Marlo was going to make sure it went where Caleb had intended it to go all along. She finished her tea and went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she had not expected to. Some nights were not made for sleeping. Some nights were made for lying awake in the dark and understanding that your life had just changed in ways you would spend years learning to comprehend. This was one of those nights. When she finally slept, she dreamed of a man standing beside a granite outcropping with one hand on the stone, his face in shadow, his posture suggesting he had been there before and would be there again, as patient as the mountain itself, waiting for someone to finally come and find what he had left behind. Bennett's reply came at 6 in the morning. Noon works. Where do you want to meet? Marlowe sat at her kitchen table with her coffee and typed back. The cafe on Olive, the one near the hospital. A pause then. Okay. You are scaring me a little. She did not respond to that. There was no way to explain what she needed to explain in a text message. Some things required being in the same room. Some things required looking someone in the eye and saying the words out loud, and watching their face change as the meaning landed. She spent the morning organizing her files, every photograph from the vault time-stamped and cataloged, every document she had photographed, the journal entries, the patent papers, the letter, the newspaper clipping, the warning note. She created a master folder and labeled it with the date she had found the hatch, October 11th, 2023. The day everything changed. At 10, Vivian Ashford called. I am filing the preservation motion this morning. The county will have it by noon. I am also sending a formal notice to the Regional Park Service Office informing them that the site is now under legal protection, pending historical assessment. That notice will go to Calloway's desk. How long before he responds? Hours. Maybe less. He will call you. Do not meet with him alone. Do not discuss the site. If he insists on a meeting, tell him your attorney will be present. Understood. Miss Thorne. A pause. Marlowe. I have been doing this for 30 years. I have seen land disputes that took decades to resolve. I have seen cases where the evidence was clear and the outcome still uncertain. What you have here is different. The documentation is extraordinary. The timeline is traceable. The fraud is demonstrable. If we execute this correctly, you will win. Marlowe looked out her window at the forest. What does correctly mean? It means we control the narrative. We file first. We establish the facts. We force them to respond to our case, not the other way around. And we do not give them time to remove evidence or create alternative explanations. She paused again. The journal. The original. Do you know where it is? In the vault. On the workbench. We need to secure it before anyone else accesses the site. The preservation order will prevent legal access. But if Summit has been monitoring the location, they may not wait for legal permission. Marlowe felt something tighten in her chest. You think they will go in? I think they have been filing regulatory comments for 2 years about land they know was stolen. I think they have been cultivating a regional director to eliminate the one person watching that land. I think they are not going to sit quietly while a legal hold gets filed over a site they did not know existed until 3 days ago. How would they know it exists? Vivian's voice went careful. You said there were boot prints at the site when you went back. 2 people. Recent. Yes. Then they already know. They do not know what is in the vault, but they know something is there. And once my preservation notice hits Calloway's desk, he will make a phone call. And whoever is on the other end of that phone will make a decision about what to do next. Marlowe stood up. I am going back. Not alone. And not without documentation. If you go in and find evidence of tampering, we need a witness and we need photographs that will hold up in court. Can Garrett Lockwood meet you there? I will call him. Do it now. Go in together. Document everything. If the journal is missing, we need to know immediately. Marlowe called Garrett before she left the cabin. He picked up on the first ring. Vivian thinks Summit might access the vault. Can you meet me at the site? When? Now. I am 20 minutes out. I will be there. She drove to the trailhead faster than she should have. The October morning was clear and cold. The kind of light that made everything sharp-edged and precisely defined. She parked next to Garrett's truck. He was waiting beside it, a day pack over his shoulder, his face set in the expression of someone who had made a decision and was committed to seeing it through. They did not talk on the hike in. There was nothing to say that would not be better said after they saw what they were going to see. The fallen sequoia came into view through the trees. The depression. The exposed root ball. Everything as Marlowe had left it 2 days ago, except Garrett saw it at the same time she did. He stopped walking and put his hand out to stop her. The hatch was open, not just tested this time, not the disturbed collar and cleared handle recess she had photographed on her second visit. Open. Pulled back fully and left that way. The handle locked in the upright position. The seal broken. The shaft uncovered and dark in the gray morning light. Cold air still rose from below, the mineral smell of the vault mixing with something else. Diesel. Faint but present. The scent of exhaust that had drifted on the morning air and not yet dissipated. Someone had been here, recently, with a vehicle close enough that the smell carried. Marlowe pulled out her phone and started photographing. The open hatch, the disturbed soil around the collar, the fresh boot prints in the mud clearer now than they had been before. 2 sets, the same 2 people. Heavy tread, work boots. The impressions deep enough to suggest they had been carrying something when they climbed out. Garrett crouched at the edge of the shaft and looked down. I am going with you. She did not argue. They descended together, Garrett first, Marlowe behind. The latter held their combined weight without flexing. At the bottom, the passage stretched ahead into darkness. Garrett turned on his flashlight and moved forward. Marlowe followed. The chamber looked at first as it had before. The crates were there. All 27 still on their shelves, still closed, still arranged with the order Caleb had given them. Whatever time constraints or logistical limits had governed the intrusion, moving 2,000 pounds of gold bars without equipment was not on the agenda. But the workbench was wrong. Marlowe crossed to it and stopped. The workbench was bare. clear in a way it had not been before, in a way that was more than just emptiness. The tin cup was there, the stiffened cloth, the kerosene lantern with its clouded glass chimney. The journal was gone. Marlowe stood at the edge of the workbench and looked at the space where the journal had been, where it had sat since October 3rd, 1941, through every season of the 83 years after Caleb had set it down, where it had waited with the patience of something that had learned to measure time in centuries rather than years. Gone. Garrett moved his flashlight across the empty surface. They took it. Yes. He walked the perimeter of the room, checking the shelves, the alcove. The alcove was untouched. The canvas still in place. The photograph of Caleb still on the stone shelf. The tin box. Marlowe crossed to the alcove and checked. The tin box was there. The letter. The documents. The newspaper clipping. Everything as she had left it. They had not found the alcove, or they had not needed what was in it. She turned back to the workbench. Garrett was photographing the empty surface from multiple angles, documenting the absence the way you document a crime scene. They knew what they were looking for, Marlowe said. He lowered his camera. The journal. They took the one thing that would make their fraud case harder to prove. The contemporaneous written record from the patent holder himself. Except they do not know about the photographs. No, they do not. Marlowe pulled out her phone and photographed the empty workbench, the space where the journal had been, the untouched lamp and cup and cloth, the specific geography of absence. Then she photographed the alcove from outside the canvas. The fact that it had not been disturbed. The fact that the most important documents were still here because she had moved them 2 days ago. "We need to go," Garrett said. "If they were here this morning, they might come back." They climbed out of the vault and stood in the October light. Marlowe pulled the hatch closed and photographed it from every angle. Then she called Vivian Ashford. The lawyer answered immediately. They went in. "The journal is gone." A pause. Just the journal. Just the journal. The gold is still there. The alcove was not disturbed. Then they got what they came for, and they do not know what they missed. Marlowe looked at the hatch. "What do we do?" "I file an emergency motion for a site inspection and evidence seizure. I contact the FBI. This is no longer just a land claim. This is evidence tampering in an active legal proceeding. How fast can you move? I am calling the San Francisco field office now. Expect someone to contact you within 2 hours." Marlowe put the phone away. Garrett was standing at the edge of the depression, looking down at the boot prints. "Do you recognize the tread pattern?" she asked. "No, but I can tell you they were not trying to hide. They came in with tools and they came in confident. Because Calloway told them they could. Or because they think they own this land and everything under it. They drove back to the trailhead in separate trucks. Marlowe did not go home. She drove straight to Fresno. She had 2 hours before she was supposed to meet Bennett. And she spent them in a coffee shop, 3 blocks from Vivian Ashford's office, going through the photographs on her phone one more time. 22 images of the journal. Every page Caleb had written from the first entry in October 1934 to the last entry in October 1941. Every word in sequence, every date, every notation about the vein and the yield and the bars he had cast and stored. And the final entry, the one that named the fraud explicitly and left instructions for Wesley. They had taken the physical document, but the evidence of what it contained was time-stamped to October 11th, 2023 at 9:42 in the morning. 4 days ago. Before Summit knew the vault existed. Before anyone except Marlowe and Garrett knew what was in it. The metadata was going to matter. The timestamps were going to matter. The fact that she had documented everything before the journal disappeared was going to be the difference between a land claim and a criminal case. Her phone buzzed. A text from Bennett. I am here. Corner table. She walked the 3 blocks to the cafe. Bennett was sitting with his back to the wall, a cup of coffee in front of him. His face carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to hope for good news, but was willing to listen. He stood when she came in. Marlowe. What is going on? Sit down. He sat. She sat across from him and put her phone on the table. I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get through it before you say anything. Okay. She started at the beginning. The storm. The fallen Sequoia. The hatch. The vault. The gold. The journal. The letter from Caleb to Weston. Bennett listened without interrupting. His face changed in stages. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked like he was trying to solve an equation that did not balance. When she got to the photographs, she turned the phone toward him and let him scroll through the images. The chamber, the crates, the gold bars, the journal pages. He stopped at the photograph of the letter, the one addressed to Wesley. He read it slowly. His lips moved slightly as he went through the words. When he finished, he looked up at her. Weston never got this. No. He kept reading. He went through it twice. Then he set the phone down carefully and sat back in his chair. Caleb wrote this for him, and Weston walked over it for 23 years and never knew. Yes. Bennett looked out of the window at the Fresno afternoon. Traffic. Pedestrians. The ordinary movement of a city on a Tuesday. He was quiet for a long time. What does this mean? He said finally. It means the land was stolen. The patent was forged. Summit Timber has known about the fraud since at least 2019, and they have been working to acquire the land anyway. She paused. It means we have a legal claim to 412 acres of Sierra Nevada forest and approximately $97 million in gold. Bennett's expression did not change. He was still processing, still trying to make the numbers and the timeline and the implications fit together into something that made sense. The medical bills, Marlowe said quietly. He looked at her. Gone. All of it. The specialist costs. The treatment. Everything. We have enough to cover it with real margin left. Bennett put his hand over his mouth. He closed his eyes. Marlowe watched her brother allow himself to feel something he had been carefully not feeling for 18 months. The specific weight that had been in his shoulders and his jaw, and the space behind his eyes. The mathematics of a situation that consumed money faster than he could produce it. The slow recognition that the numbers were never going to balance, and the question was only how bad it will get before something gave. She watched it let go. When he opened his eyes, they were wet. "Are you sure?" he said. "I have a land attorney. She is filing the claim. The FBI is involved because Summit stole the journal from the vault this morning. The case is real. The evidence is real. The money is real." Bennett looked at the phone again. At the photograph of Caleb's letter. "He sounds like Weston," he said. "The way he writes. Plain. No wasting words." Marlowe had not thought of that before, but hearing Bennett say it, she recognized the truth of it. Caleb and Weston, separated by 83 years and one layer of mountain, both writing in the same direct syntax, both saying what needed to be said, and nothing more. Some things travel through families without anyone intending to transmit them. "What happens next?" Bennett asked. "The legal process, authentication of the documents, preservation of the site, FBI investigation into the theft, settlement negotiations or trial. It will take months, maybe years, but it ends with the land validated and the gold secured. Yes." And Caleb's name cleared. Yes. Bennett reached across the table and took her hand. He did not say anything. He did not need to. They sat like that for a moment in the cafe in Fresno, while the afternoon went on around them, and the people at the other tables drank their coffee and checked their phones and had no idea that the two people in the corner booth had just had their lives change in a way that would take years to fully comprehend. Marlowe's phone buzzed. A call from a number she did not recognize with a San Francisco area code. She answered. "Marlowe Thorne. Ms. Thorne, this is Special Agent Sloan Parrish, FBI San Francisco Field Office. I understand you have some information about a document theft." "Yes. I am driving to Fresno now. Can you meet me at your attorney's office at 4? "Yes, I will see you then." The call ended. Marlowe looked at Bennett. "FBI, 4 o'clock. He nodded. "Do you want me to come?" "No. Go home. Rest. I will call you tonight." They stood. Bennett pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than usual. When he stepped back, his face had the expression of someone who had just been told something impossible and was choosing to believe it anyway. "Thank you," he said. "I did not do this. Caleb did. You found it. The mountain gave it up. I just happened to be walking the trail the morning it decided to let go." She drove to Vivian Ashford's office and arrived 15 minutes early. The lawyer was waiting with a woman Marlowe had not met. Mid-40s, trim, dark suit. The quality of attention that suggested federal law enforcement before introductions were made. "Sloan Parrish," the woman said. "FBI White Collar Crime Division. Vivian brought me up to speed." "Tell me what happened this morning." Marlowe walked her through it. The open hatch, the diesel smell, the boot prints, the missing journal, the untouched alcove. The fact that she had photographed every page of the journal 4 days before it was taken. Agent Parrish listened without interrupting. When Marlowe finished, she opened a laptop and pulled up a form. I need you to walk me through the photographs. Every image you took of the journal. I need to see the timestamps and the metadata. Marlowe handed over her phone. Parrish connected it to the laptop and began downloading the files. She worked in silence for 10 minutes, checking timestamps, examining metadata, comparing image sequences. When she looked up, her expression had shifted into something harder. These timestamps put you at the site on October 11th at 9:42 a.m. Yes. 4 days before the preservation order was filed. Yes. Which means these photographs were taken before anyone except you and Mr. Lockwood knew the vault existed. Correct. Parrish sat back. Miss Thorne, what you have here is a complete photographic record of a document that no longer exists in physical form. The metadata confirms when and where the photographs were taken. The timestamps establish that you documented the journal before it was removed. In federal court, this is admissible evidence of the document's contents. What about the physical journal? If we find it, we can authenticate the photographs against the original. If we do not find it, the photographs still stand as evidence of what was there. The fact that the document was subsequently removed actually strengthens your case because it demonstrates consciousness of guilt on the part of whoever took it. She looked at Vivian. You filed the preservation order this morning at 11. The notice went to the Regional Park Service office at 11:15. Parrish made a note, and the theft occurred sometime between then and when Ms. Thorne arrived at the site, which means someone received that notice and made a decision to access the site immediately. She closed the laptop. I am opening a federal investigation. Wire fraud, obstruction of justice, theft of evidence. The charges will depend on what we find, but the structure is clear. Someone took a document from a protected site that they knew was under legal review. She looked at Marlowe. I am going to need a full statement. Everything from the moment you found the hatch to the moment you discovered the journal was missing. And I am going to need Mr. Lockwood to give the same statement. How long will this take? Weeks for the preliminary investigation, months for the full case. But I can tell you this. Whoever took that journal made a serious mistake. They thought they were destroying evidence. What they actually did was commit a federal crime that we can prove. Vivian leaned forward. What about Summit Timber? Parrish looked at her. What about them? They have been filing regulatory comments about this land for 2 years. They have a relationship with the regional director who tried to eliminate Ms. Thorne's position. And they have a documented history of using regulatory pressure to acquire boundary land. I will need everything you have on that. Filings, communications, timeline. If there is a connection between Summit and the vault access, I want to establish it. Vivienne pulled a folder from her desk. I started pulling records yesterday. Summit Timber. Pacific Ridge Holdings, the 1987 acquisition, the regulatory filings from 2019 to present, and the conference in Reno that Aldrich Calloway attended on Summit's sponsorship. Parrish took the folder and opened it. She read in silence for several minutes. When she looked up, her expression had gone very still. Pacific Ridge Holdings. That is the entity Summit acquired in 1987. Yes. And Pacific Ridge was incorporated in 1955 by a man named Harold Crane. Vivian nodded. Sacramento attorney. Specialized in land transactions in the 40s and 50s. Parrish pulled out her phone and made a call. She spoke quietly for 2 minutes, then hung up. Harold Crane was a partner at Morrison & Crane, a Sacramento law firm that handled county land office filings during the period when Caleb Thorne's patent was fraudulently transferred. The firm dissolved in 1963. Crane died in '79. But before he died, he incorporated Pacific Ridge Holdings and listed himself as sole director. Marlowe felt something click into place. The lawyer who processed the fraudulent transfer created a holding company to preserve the stolen claim. And when he died, the company sat dormant until Summit came along with enough resources to recognize what it was worth. Parrish closed the folder. This is not opportunism. This is inheritance. Summit did not stumble onto a historical anomaly. They bought a company that was created specifically to hold a fraudulent land claim, which means they knew when. I am going to find out. She looked at Marlowe. Ms. Thorne, I need you to understand something. What started as a land dispute is now a federal criminal investigation. The charges we are looking at carry significant penalties. If Summit's executives knew about the fraud and proceeded anyway, they are looking at wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction. We are talking about years. Marlowe thought about Caleb sitting in a vault by lamplight, about Weston walking the trails for 23 years, about the letter that had waited 83 years to be read. Good, she said. Parrish spent the next 2 hours taking Marlowe's statement, every detail, every observation, every photograph, every decision. When she was done, she closed her notebook and stood. I am going to the site tomorrow morning with a forensics team. We will document everything. Boot prints, tool marks, any trace evidence they left behind. And we are going to find that journal. You think they still have it. I think they took it for a reason. And that reason was not to destroy it immediately. They took it because they believe it gives them leverage, which means it exists somewhere. Where? Parrish looked at her steadily. If I were Summit's legal team and I had just stolen a document that proved my client's fraud, I would put it somewhere. I could access it if I needed to, and deny having it if I was asked. Storage unit, safety deposit box, attorney's office, somewhere with plausible deniability. Can you get a warrant? I can if I establish probable cause, which I am working on. Marlowe left the office as the sun dropped behind the western buildings of downtown Fresno. She sat in her truck for a moment and looked at her phone. 3 missed calls from a number she recognized. Aldrich Calloway. She did not call back. Vivian had told her not to engage, not to meet, not to discuss the site. Whatever Calloway wanted to say, he could say it through attorneys. She drove back to the mountains through the October dusk. The valley behind her. The high country ahead. The road climbing through foothill oak and then pine, and then the sequoias that marked the boundary of the land she had spent 11 years protecting. The land that was it now appeared hers, by blood and by law, and by the particular stubbornness of a mountain that had refused to let go of what Caleb Thorne had sealed beneath it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Garrett. Calloway called me 3 times. Did not answer. Heard through the office he is asking about your patrol activity on October 11th. Someone told him you were off-grid that morning. Marlowe typed back. Let him ask. Another text came in. This one from Vivian. Summit Timber's legal team just contacted me. They want to meet. I told them we would respond to any formal communication through proper channels. They said this was informal. I said there is no such thing as informal in a federal investigation. They hung up. Marlowe read the message twice. Summit was moving. They knew the preservation order had been filed. They knew the FBI was involved. They were trying to establish contact before the investigation locked them out, which meant they were worried. She parked at her cabin and went inside. The October night was cold and the cabin had the particular chill of a space that had not been heated all day. She built a fire in the wood stove and sat in front of it with her laptop. She opened her email and found a message from Vivian time-stamped an hour ago. Forensic document analysis is scheduled for next week. They will examine the photographs and compare them to known samples of 1930s county records. If the patent documents are authentic, we will have expert testimony confirming it. If the transfer documents are fraudulent, we will have expert testimony confirming that too. Also, I received a call from the California State Historical Resources Commission. They are sending a team to assess the vault for historical designation. If it qualifies, and I believe it will, the site becomes protected under state law, independent of the federal preservation order. Summit will not be able to touch it. Marlowe read the message and felt something settle in her chest. The kind of settling that comes when a thing you have been holding tightly finally locks into place, and you realize you can let go slightly without it falling apart. She wrote back, "Thank you." She spent the evening going through Weston's patrol logs again, reading the entries from his first year. 1975, the observations, the weather notations, the careful documentation of everything he saw on the surface. She found an entry from October 15th, 1975. 34 years to the day after Caleb's final journal entry. Southeast route, clear weather. Check the Sequoia stand on the eastern ridge. No signs of stress. Root system stable. Trees in good health. Weston had walked directly over the vault, had stood within 30 feet of the hatch, had noted the health of the tree that was growing its roots across the concrete collar, sealing it deeper every year, had walked away without knowing. Marlowe closed the log and sat with the quiet of her cabin, the fire in the stove, the October wind in the pines outside, the particular solitude of a life spent in places where the nearest neighbor was measured in miles rather than feet. She thought about what Parrish had said. Years. The charges carried years. She thought about what that meant for the people who had spent 2 years filing regulatory comments and cultivating Aldrich Callaway and waiting for the right moment to move on land they knew had been stolen 83 years ago. She thought about the fact that they had taken the journal this morning, that they had gone into the vault with tools and confidence and had removed the one piece of evidence that contained Caleb's own words about the fraud, that they had not known about the photographs, that they had made the mistake of assuming silence meant absence. Her phone rang. Sloane Parrish. Ms. Thorne. I wanted to update you. We executed a search warrant on Summit Timber's corporate offices 2 hours ago. We also executed warrants on 3 storage facilities rented under subsidiary names. Did you find it? We found the journal in a storage unit in Fresno, climate-controlled, professionally packed, rented under a subsidiary called Sierra Land Holdings. Marlowe sat up. You have it. We have it. And we have the rental agreement. And we have security footage showing 2 men accessing the unit this morning at 11:45, 30 minutes after the preservation order hit Callaway's desk. Who were they? We are working on identification, but the unit was rented by Summit's senior vice president of land acquisitions, a man named Douglas Merrick. Parrish's voice went harder. We also found something else in the office search. Internal emails. Correspondence between Merrick and Summit's regulatory council. The emails go back to 2019. What do they say? Agent Parrish paused. Ms. Thorne, I am going to read you one email. It was sent from Douglas Merrick to the regulatory team on March 14th, 2019. The subject line is Eastern Boundary Strategy. She read slowly. Original 1941 transfer of Thorne patent, known to be fraudulent per Pacific Ridge. Due diligence documents from 1987 acquisition. Patent holder descendants unlikely to surface after 78 years. Recommend proceeding with regulatory pressure strategy to reclassify eastern boundary as unmonitored. Once protection removed, historical claim can be filed without contest. Estimated timeline 36 months. Silence. Marlowe sat in her cabin and listened to the fire and tried to process what she had just heard. They knew, she said finally. They knew in 2019. They knew the transfer was fraudulent. They knew it was stolen. And they built a multi-year strategy around the assumption that no one would ever find out. Parrish's voice was flat. Douglas Merrick and Summit's regulatory council are being arrested tonight. Wire fraud. Conspiracy to commit fraud against the federal government. Obstruction of justice. The U.S. Attorney is reviewing additional charges. What about Callaway? He is being interviewed tomorrow morning. If we can establish that he knowingly participated in the scheme, he will face charges too. Marlowe looked out her window at the dark forest. How long have you been doing this? 20 years. Have you seen anything like this before? Parrish was quiet for a moment. I have seen corporate fraud. I have seen land theft. I have seen people steal things they thought no one would miss. But I have never seen someone inherit a fraud from 1941 and decide the smart move was to finish what their predecessors started. That takes a specific kind of arrogance, or desperation, maybe. But arrogance is what I am betting on. Marlowe heard papers rustling on the other end of the line. Ms. Thorne, I want you to understand what happens next. This is no longer just your case. This is a federal prosecution. The journal is evidence. The emails are evidence. The photographs you took are evidence. Everything we found today goes into building a criminal case against Summit and its executives. What does that mean for the land claim? It means you will get your land. The fraud is documented. The patent is valid. The transfer is void. Vivian will handle the civil proceedings, but the criminal case actually makes your claim stronger because we are establishing intent and knowledge on Summit's part. She paused. The gold is a separate matter. Estate processing, tax implications. But structurally, it is yours. When? Months. The authentication process. The settlement negotiations. The estate probate. But the outcome is not in question. Marlowe thought about Bennett, about the medical bills, about the particular relief that had been in his face when she told him the numbers. "Thank you," she said. "You found it," Parrish said. "You documented it. You called the right people. You did everything correctly. That is why this is working." The call ended. Marlowe sat in the firelight and thought about what correctly meant. It meant she had gone down into the vault before calling it in. It meant she had photographed everything before anyone knew it existed. It meant she had taken the tin box to a safety deposit box instead of leaving it in the alcove. It meant she had trusted her instincts over protocol, had chosen to protect the evidence before she reported it, had understood in some part of herself that operated below conscious thought that this was not a situation where institutional process could be trusted. Weston had taught her that without meaning to, had shown her through his careful silence about his own father that some things get lost when you trust the wrong people with them, that some truths need to be held close until you know who can be trusted to hear them. She had held this close for 4 days. And in those 4 days, she had built a record that was now going to bring down a company that had spent 37 years waiting to finish a theft that started in 1941. Her phone buzzed. A text from Bennett. "Are you okay?" She typed back, "Yes, FBI found the journal. Summit executives being arrested tonight." It is real. 3 dots appeared. Then, I do not know what to say. You do not have to say anything. Just rest. I will call you tomorrow. The dots again. Then, Weston would be proud of you. Marlowe looked at the text for a long time. She thought about her grandfather. about the way he had walked the trails with the same steady attention she walked them now, about the photograph on the shelf above his fireplace, about the silence he had kept for 70 years. She thought about the letter he had never read. Fight for the land, Wesley. Not because land is everything. Fight because someone took it from us, and wrong things do not stop being wrong just because they go unanswered. Weston had never known those words were waiting for him. 15 feet below the ground. He walked every day. But Marlowe knew them now. And she was doing what Caleb had asked. She was fighting for the land. She went to bed late and slept better than she had in days. When she woke, the October morning was cold and clear. She made coffee and checked her email. A message from Vivian time-stamped 5 a.m. Douglas Merrick and Summit's Regulatory Council were arrested at 6 p.m. yesterday. Both are in federal custody. Callaway is cooperating with the investigation in exchange for consideration. He has provided documentation of his communications with Summit going back to 2018. The preservation order is now supported by a federal criminal hold. No one can access the vault without FBI clearance. Agent Parrish's team will complete the site documentation today, and Marlowe, the authentication report came back preliminary. The patent documents are genuine. 1930s paper. Period appropriate ink. County stamps consistent with records from that era. The expert is willing to testify. Summit's fraud claim is dead. Marlowe read the message twice. Then she got dressed and drove to the trailhead. The FBI forensics team was already at the site when she arrived. Agent Parrish was standing at the edge of the depression, watching two technicians work the boot prints with casting material. Miss Thorne Parrish said, "You are early. I wanted to see it." Parrish gestured to the hatch. "We documented everything. Tool marks, trace materials. The gasket seal shows recent forcing consistent with a pry bar. We have samples. Did you go inside?" 2 hours ago. Photographed every surface. Dusted for prints. The alcove was untouched like you said. The crates are still sealed. We will need to do a formal inventory, but that will wait until the court approves it. She looked at Marlowe. "Your great-grandfather built something that lasted 83 years without anyone knowing it was here. That is extraordinary preservation. He built it to last. He did. And he was right to trust the mountain to keep it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the technicians work. The October forest settling into its morning rhythms around them. Birds in the canopy. Water running in the distance. The sound of the wind in the high branches. What happens to Callaway? Marlowe asked. He is negotiating a plea. Cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. He will lose his position. He will pay restitution. He will probably avoid jail time if he gives us everything we need on Summit. And Summit. Parrish's expression went flat. Summit is done. The criminal charges. The civil liability. The regulatory violations. They will spend years in court, and millions in legal fees, and they will lose. Companies do not survive this kind of exposure. She looked at the vault. Your land will be clear, the patent validated, the fraud voided, and you will have approximately $150 million in combined assets once the estate is settled. Marlowe thought about what $150 million meant, not in abstract terms, but in concrete ones. Bennett's medical bills covered for life, a house for him, security, the ability to breathe without the constant calculation of how many months until the money ran out, and the land, 412 acres of old-growth sequoia forest that would stay protected, that would never be logged or developed or stripped of the silence that Caleb had worked in, and Weston had walked through, and Marlowe had spent 11 years defending. "Thank you," she said. Parrish shook her head. "You did this. You found it. You documented it. You protected it. I am just the person who showed up to make sure the people who tried to steal it face consequences." She handed Marlowe a business card. "My direct line. If anything else comes up, call me immediately." Marlowe took the card and put it in her pocket. She looked at the fallen sequoia, at the root ball tilted against the October sky, at the depression that had held a secret for 83 years and had finally given it up on the night a storm came through, and a ranger was walking the trail early, the way rangers were supposed to walk trails early after storms. The mountain keeps its own. It had kept this. And now Marlowe was going to make sure it went where it belonged. She drove back to her cabin and spent the afternoon organizing files, legal documents, photographs, correspondence, everything in chronological order, everything labeled and time-stamped and ready for whatever came next. At 4, her phone rang. "Vivienne Ashford. Summit wants to settle." Already. "Their legal team called an hour ago. They want to avoid trial. They are prepared to offer a significant settlement in exchange for a release of civil claims." "How significant?" "I have not heard the number yet." "They are sending a formal proposal tomorrow. But Marlowe, you need to understand. A settlement means this ends faster. No trial, no years of litigation. You get the land, you get compensation. Summit admits no wrongdoing, but they pay. What do you think?" "I think we have them. The criminal case is solid. The patent is valid. The fraud is documented. If we go to trial, we win. But trials take time." She paused. "The question is what you want. Fast resolution or public vindication." Marlowe thought about Caleb, about the final entry in his journal, about the letter he had written knowing he might not survive to see it read. Fight for the land. Not because land is everything. Fight because someone took it from She had fought. She had won. The land was secure. The fraud was exposed. Summit's executives were facing federal charges. Caleb had not asked for public vindication. He had asked for the land to be protected and the truth to be preserved. Both of those things were happening. "I want the patent validated," Marlowe said. "I want the land secured. I want it on the record that the 1941 transfer was fraudulent and that Summit knew it. That can be part of the settlement terms. Then I will listen to their offer." "Good. I will call you when I have the proposal." Marlowe hung up and looked out her window at the forest. The same forest she had looked at every day for 11 years. The same trees. The same mountains. Everything the same. Everything different. She thought about her brother Bennett and the relief in his face. She thought about Agent Parrish and the federal charges that were going to follow Summit's executives for years. She thought about Aldrich Calloway cooperating with investigators and losing the position he had used to try to eliminate the one person watching over land that was never his to give away. She thought about Weston walking these trails for 23 years and never knowing what was 15 feet below his boots. And she thought about Caleb, sitting in a vault by lamplight, writing a letter to a son he would never see grow up, sealing the truth in granite darkness and trusting the mountain to keep it until someone came along who would know what to do with it. That someone had been Marlowe, and she had done what Caleb asked. She had fought for the land. She had protected the truth. She had finished what 3 generations of Thorne family members had started without knowing they were part of the same story. The mountain had kept its promise. Now Marlowe was keeping hers. The court-supervised vault assessment was scheduled for November 3rd, 3 weeks after Agent Parrish's forensics team had documented the site and secured the journal. Marlowe stood at the trailhead at 7 in the morning and watched a convoy of vehicles arrive. Federal preservationist, certified assayer, geological surveyor, Vivian Ashford as legal representative, Agent Parrish overseeing chain of custody. They hiked to the site in a single-file line carrying equipment cases and documentation tablets, moving through the October forest with the careful efficiency of people who understood they were about to catalog something that would matter in court for years to come. Marlowe was permitted to observe but not to handle anything during the formal process. She stood at the entry to the passage and watched 7 people move through the vault with methodical precision that was in its own way an odd thing to witness after everything that had led to this moment. The space that had been sealed and silent for 83 years, that Marlowe had stood in alone with a flashlight, and the sound of her own breathing was now lit by portable LED panels and occupied by professionals with equipment cases and documentation tablets. The crates were opened in sequence, each one photographed before and after. The burlap layers removed with the careful deliberateness of a surgical procedure. Each bar was lifted, weighed on a portable scale, photographed from multiple angles, logged with its serial number and its 1930 stamp, and placed in a labeled evidence container. The assayer, a man named Thomas Garrett, who had the comfortable physical authority of someone who spent his career doing precise work, paused over the first bar Marlowe had opened and looked at the stamp for a long time. "You said you found this alone," he said. "Yes. And your first response was to put it back. I photographed it first." Thomas looked at her with the considering expression of someone recalibrating a prior assumption. "Most people do not put it back." It was not mine to take. It took 9 hours across 2 days. The morning light filtering down through the shaft, the cold air rising from the granite, the particular silence of deep stone cut occasionally by the sound of equipment or the careful voices of people reading serial numbers into recording devices. The assayer's preliminary report filed the following week listed 53 bars of gold averaging 11.8 kilograms each, with purity ratings between 900 and 925 fine gold. The bars were consistent in manufacture with commercial gold processing operations in California's Central Sierra Nevada region in the 1930s. The assayer noted that the quality of preservation was remarkable. The combination of dry, cold air, stable temperature, and the absence of moisture infiltration had maintained the bars in near original condition. He noted in his report that this level of preservation in a structure built without specialized environmental control represented an unusual and probably intentional choice of site. Caleb Thorne had known what the mountain's cold and dry stone would do, and he had built accordingly. Total assessed value at current market rates: $97 million. Marlowe read the number in Vivian Ashford's office on a gray November morning, with rain coming off the Sierra and running down the office windows in sheets. She read it twice. Vivian watched her read it and waited with the patience of someone who understood that very large numbers require a certain amount of time to become real. The land, Marlowe said. I was getting to that. Vivian opened a second file. The geological survey team found the mineral vein Caleb documented in the journal, still intact, sealed exactly as he described. The entry point had been collapsed deliberately. From the look of it, Caleb likely did it himself before sealing the vault. But the vein runs through accessible granite below the surface level. She turned a page. The geological assessment puts the remaining extractable mineral content in the range of $30 to $50 million, depending on current commodity prices and extraction costs. That assessment does not include any potential secondary mineral deposits identified along the same geological shelf, which the survey team flagged as a separate line item. I do not want to mine it. Vivian did not change expression. That is your choice to make, and it does not affect the assessed value for legal purposes. The land's conservation value, assessed independently by a certified appraiser, came in at $62 million for the 412 acres. That is the figure a federal land trust would pay to acquire it under willing seller, willing buyer terms. I am not a willing seller, I know, but it establishes a floor. She looked at Marlowe evenly. The combined valuation: gold mineral rights land, approximately $200 million, give or take the variables. That is a preliminary figure. It will be refined through the formal legal process. Marlowe looked at the rain on the windows for a while. $200 million. A number large enough that approaching it directly was impossible. You had to come at it sideways, in the specific terms it translated into. Bennett's medical bills indefinitely without strain. A house he owned rather than rented. Her cabin in the mountains paid for permanently. The patrol work, which she was going to keep doing because the trees did not know about estate settlements and still needed someone watching. She thought about what the number meant in broader terms. The ability to protect 412 acres in perpetuity, to establish a conservation trust that would outlast her, to make sure that what Caleb had sealed and Weston had walked over, and she had found would never be touched by the forces that had tried to take it. That felt real in a way the raw number did not. Vivienne was still watching her. I filed the formal adverse claim to the 1941 transfer document on Monday. The case is strong. It was always strong once we had the photographs. What Summit took from that vault was a physical object. What they could not take was the evidence of what it contained. She said it matter-of-factly the way she said everything, and Marlowe appreciated the matter-of-factness because drama would not have served the moment. The forensic document report, when it arrived in full, was 53 pages long and addressed exactly one question. Was the signature on the 1941 land transfer document genuinely produced by Caleb Emmett Thorne? The answer, supported by handwriting analysis, ink composition testing, and paper degradation patterns, was definitively no. The signature had been produced by a different hand, attempting to replicate a signature the forger had seen in other documents. The attempt was skilled enough to pass a non-expert review in 1941, which was presumably why it had passed. It was not skilled enough to survive modern forensic analysis. Vivienne filed the adverse claim the Monday after the report landed. Summit's response took 4 days. Their legal team, a large firm out of San Francisco, whose billing rates Marlowe tried not to think about, filed a counter motion challenging the authenticity of the photographs and arguing that photographs of a document could not serve as evidentiary substitutes for the document itself. The argument had a certain surface logic. Vivienne demolished it in 9 pages that established precedent by precedent that digitally time-stamped photographic documentation created before a document's removal was established. Evidentiary procedure in both state and federal courts. The judge, a woman in her late 60s who had been hearing land disputes in the Central Valley for 21 years and had little patience for arguments that wasted her time, sided with Vivienne in a ruling that was brief and direct. Summit's counter motion was denied. The adverse claim proceeded. It was during the discovery phase of the adverse claim that the ongoing FBI investigation produced its most significant public finding. Agent Parrish called Marlowe on a Tuesday afternoon in late November while she was filing her monthly patrol report at the ranger station. The first snow had fallen in the high country the night before, and the morning had been spent checking trail markers and documenting the early accumulation patterns. "We have something you need to hear," Parrish said. Marlowe stepped outside into the cold November afternoon. "What did you find?" "Internal communications, Summit corporate emails, the full archive going back to 2015. We subpoenaed everything as part of the criminal case, and there is a thread from March 2019 between Douglas Merrick and the regulatory team. 23 emails over 6 weeks. They are planning the entire eastern boundary strategy." Parrish's voice went harder. "I am going to read you one email, sent from Merrick to Summit's chief legal counsel on March 28, 2019. Subject line is Risk Assessment Eastern Parcel. She read slowly. Pacific Ridge acquisition documents from 1987 clearly indicate original Thorne patent transfer. In 1941 was executed without proper authorization. Legal review at time of acquisition noted potential fraud, but recommended no action given age of claim and presumed extinction of Thorne family line. Recommend proceeding with boundary reclassification strategy as planned. 78 years provides sufficient distance from original transaction. Likelihood of challenge approaches 0. Silence on the line. Marlowe stood in the November cold outside the ranger station and listened to the wind in the pines and tried to process what she had just heard. They knew in '87, she said, finally, when they bought Pacific Ridge. They knew then. They knew. And they sat on it for 32 years, waiting. And in 2019, they decided the wait was long enough. Parrish continued. We also found correspondence between Merrick and Aldrich Calloway. 18 emails between August 2018 and September 2023. Calloway was recruited specifically to handle the redundancy review. Summit paid him through a consulting contract with a subsidiary. $50,000 over 3 years. For what? For eliminating the one person who might notice if something happened to Sector 7. Marlowe thought about the 8 months she had spent watching her job posting sit on the internal board. The public comment hearing where she had presented erosion data and poaching statistics, and Calloway had thanked her for her time with the smooth dismissal of someone who had already made his decision. The patient erosion of institutional protection over land that Summit had been circling for 37 years, with the confidence of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. What happens to them? Marlowe asked. Merrick and Summit's chief counsel are being arraigned next week. Wire fraud. Conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States. Obstruction of justice. The charges carry a combined maximum of 40 years. And Calloway. Parrish exhaled. Calloway is testifying for the prosecution. Full cooperation. He is giving us everything. The recruitment, the payments, the coordination. In exchange, he gets a deferred prosecution agreement, 2 years probation, restitution equal to your salary for the period he influenced the review. Permanent ban from federal employment. It is not enough. No. But it gets us what we need to convict the people who planned this. Marlowe looked across the parking lot at the mountains. The same mountains Caleb had looked at when he decided to fight. The same mountains Weston had looked at every morning for 23 years. When do you need me to testify? Preliminary hearing is in January. Trial is scheduled for May if they do not settle. But Marlowe, I need you to understand something. What? Summit is going to offer you a settlement before we get to trial. A large one. They are going to try to make this go away quietly. Vivienne already told me. What she might not have told you is that the settlement will come with conditions. Confidentiality clauses. Non-disparagement agreements. They will want you to take the money and never speak about this publicly. What did you tell her? I told her you should take the settlement if the terms protect the land and validate the patent. The criminal case will proceed regardless. Merrick and the council are going to prison whether you settle the civil claim or not. Parrish paused. But the decision is yours. If you want your day in court, if you want to stand up in front of a judge and tell this story on the record, we can do that. It will take longer and cost more, and the outcome on the civil side is not guaranteed, even though we think you will win. But it is your right. Marlowe thought about Caleb's letter, about the words he had written to a son who never read them. Fight for the land. Not because land is everything. Fight because someone took it from us. She had fought. The land was secure. The fraud was exposed. The people responsible were facing consequences. What Caleb had asked for was happening. I want the patent validated, Marlowe said. I want it on the public record that the 1941 transfer was fraudulent and void. I want the land title clear. If Summit will agree to that in a settlement, I will listen. That is what Vivian said you would say. Is it the right call? Parrish was quiet for a moment. In my experience, the right call is the one that gets you what you actually want, rather than what you think you are supposed to want. You want the land protected and your family's name cleared. A settlement can do that faster than a trial. Thank you, Marlowe. One more thing. Yes. Your great-grandfather knew he was probably going to die. He wrote that letter knowing he might not make it out of the mountains. And he still took the time to build something that would last. That takes a particular kind of courage. He trusted the mountain to keep it. And it did. For 83 years. That is not luck. That is faith in something larger than himself. The call ended. Marlowe stood in the parking lot and looked at the ranger station, the building where she had filed her reports for 11 years. The place where Garrett Lockwood had quietly handed her information he could not afford to have traced back to him, where she had learned the difference between what you knew and what you could prove, and how to stay on the right side of that line. She went inside and finished her patrol report. Weather observations, trail conditions, snow accumulation estimates, the steady documentation of the surface while 15 feet below the oldest Sequoia on the eastern ridge, a vault held evidence that was going to change everything. Summit's settlement offer came 2 weeks later. Vivienne called on a Friday afternoon in early December. The high country was deep in snow by then, and Marlowe had spent the morning running the winter safety check on the remote trail shelters, making sure the emergency supplies were stocked and the heating systems functional. They sent the proposal, Vivian said. Do you want the number first or the terms? The terms. Full validation of the Caleb Thorne 1936 land patent. Official voiding of the 1941 transfer as fraudulent. Clear title to the 412 acres transferred to your name. All mineral rights intact. Summit relinquishes any and all historical claims to the parcel. That was what Marlowe had asked for. What else? Cash settlement of $14 million. That covers their exposure on the civil fraud claim, compensates for legal fees and damages, and represents what they are willing to pay to avoid a public trial. Vivian paused. There is a confidentiality clause, standard language. You cannot discuss the settlement terms publicly. You can discuss the patent validation and the land title because those are public record. But you cannot discuss the cash amount or the specifics of Summit's admissions. Can I discuss the criminal case? The criminal case is separate. That is public record. You can discuss anything that comes out in the trial or the plea agreements. What do you think? I think this is a good settlement. You get the land. You get validation. You get compensation. Summit avoids a public trial where every email and every decision gets read into the record. They are paying for silence about how much they are paying. Marlowe looked out her cabin window at the December forest. Snow on the branches. The particular quiet of winter in the high country. She thought about Caleb sitting in the vault and writing instructions for Wesley. She thought about Weston walking the trails and never knowing what was below him. She thought about the letter that had waited 83 years to be read. Accept it, she said. Are you sure? The land is protected. The patent is validated. The fraud is voided. That is what Caleb asked for. The number they are paying is between them and their lawyers. I do not need it on the public record. I will call them today. Vivian, one more thing. Yes, the gold, the estate processing. When does that happen? I have been working with a tax specialist. The estate will go through probate. You and Bennett are the direct descendants. The processing will take 6 to 8 months. But the preliminary number after taxes and fees is approximately $68 million split between you and your brother. Marlowe let that sit for a moment. 68 million divided by 2. 34 million each. Bennett's medical bills were $180,000. A rounding error against 34 million. Thank you, Marlowe said. You did this. You found it. You protected it. You finished what your great-grandfather started. The settlement was finalized on December 20th. Vivian called with the news while Marlowe was stringing lights on the small pine tree she kept in her cabin every winter. A tradition from childhood. Weston had always kept a tree. Small and simple. Lights and nothing else. It is done, Vivian said. The judge signed the order this morning. The patent is validated. The land title is clear. The transfer is voided. Summit's payment will be in your account by the end of the month. Marlowe sat down at her kitchen table. It is really over. The civil case is over. The criminal case is still proceeding. Merrick and the council are going to trial in May unless they take a plea. Calloway's deferred prosecution was finalized yesterday. He is banned from federal employment. He paid restitution. He is done. What about the land? Yours. 412 acres. Clear title. No encumbrances. You can do whatever you want with it. Marlowe thought about what she wanted to do with it. I want to establish a conservation trust. I want the land protected in perpetuity. No logging, no mining, no development. I want it to stay exactly as it is. That is what I thought you would say. I have a colleague who specializes in conservation law. I will set up a meeting. Thank you for everything. Vivian's voice softened slightly. Marlowe, in 30 years of practice, I have handled land disputes that took decades to resolve. I have seen families torn apart over inheritance. I have seen people lose everything fighting for something they should have won. What you did here, the way you handled this, is exceptional. You trusted your instincts. You documented carefully. You made good decisions under pressure. And you finished what needed to be finished. I had help. You had good advisors, but you made the calls. That matters. Marlowe hung up and sat in her cabin with the lights strung on the tree, and the December afternoon going dark outside. She called Bennett. "It is done," she said when he answered. "The settlement. Signed. The land is ours. The patent is validated. The fraud is voided. And the estate processing will be complete by summer." Bennett was quiet for a moment. "How much?" "After taxes and fees, $34 million each." She heard him sit down. $34 million. Yes. The medical bills, he said quietly. Gone. All of it. With enough left that you never have to think about money again. Bennett made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else. "I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything. Just live." That is what Caleb wanted. For us to have the freedom to live without the weight of what was stolen from him. Marlowe. A pause. "Thank you. I found it. You are family. This is as much yours as it is mine." They talked for another 20 minutes, about nothing in particular, about the weather and the holidays, and the fact that Bennett had started looking at houses in the nicer parts of Fresno, places with yards and good schools nearby, even though he did not have children because he wanted the option of a future that had space in it. When they hung up, Marlowe sat in the quiet of her cabin and thought about what space meant. Not just physical space, but the mental and emotional space that comes when the constant calculation stops. When the bills are paid and the future is secure, and the weight that has been pressing against your chest for months or years finally lifts. Bennett was gonna have that space, and Marlowe had given it to him. That felt like finishing something. The California Historical Society opened its Sierra Nevada mining history exhibit in February. The curator, a woman named Patricia Osman, who had been cataloging regional history for 26 years, called Marlowe 3 weeks before the opening. "We would like to include your great-grandfather in the exhibit," she said. "The journal photographs you provided are some of the most detailed documentation of independent mining operations from the 30s we have ever encountered. What would you need from me? Permission to use the photographs. And if you have any personal artifacts, we would be honored to display them." Marlowe thought about the tin box, about the letter and the newspaper clipping and the warning note. About the photograph of Caleb standing beside the granite outcropping with his hand on the stone. "I have a photograph," she said, "and a letter he wrote to my grandfather. The letter was never delivered." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "We would treat them with the utmost care." "I know you would." The exhibit opened on February 15th. Marlowe drove to the museum in Sacramento on a cold Tuesday morning when the valley was gray with winter fog. The exhibit occupied the second floor of the Historical Society building, a series of rooms devoted to the Central Sierra mining boom. Photographs and tools and assay records, and the particular detritus of men who had worked the mountains for gold and left behind more evidence than they probably intended. The Caleb Thorne display was in the third room, a black and white reproduction of the journal's first page, mounted beside a framed copy of the 1936 land patent. And between them, the photograph from the alcove. Caleb at the rock hand resting on the stone face in shadow. The caption read, "Caleb Emmett Thorne, independent miner, 1890 to 1941. Patented 412 acres of Sierra Nevada land in 1936. His records sealed in an underground vault for 83 years were discovered by his great-granddaughter, Marlowe Thorne, in October 2023, following a storm that felled a 1900-year-old Sequoia. Thorne's patent was subsequently validated in state court, after evidence confirmed the 1941 transfer of his claim to be fraudulent. Marlowe stood in front of the display for a long time. She did not announce herself to the staff. The museum was not crowded on a Tuesday morning in February, and the visitors who moved through the section paused at the display without knowing they were standing next to the woman in the caption. She listened to a child ask his father what a land patent was. She listened to the father explain in approximate terms. She thought that approximately right was enough for a Tuesday in February and a 7-year-old's attention span. She walked back out into the gray winter morning and drove toward the mountains. The 1-year anniversary of the storm came in October of 2024. Marlowe woke before dawn on the 11th and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table looking at the same forest she had looked at every morning for 12 years. The high country was gold with autumn, the aspens turning in the last warm days before the snow came. The light at this time of year had a quality of preservation to it, clear and sharp, and making everything look like it was being documented for a record that would outlast the season. She dressed and drove to the trailhead. The same route, the same parking spot, the same cold October air that tasted of pine and stone and the particular mineral scent of high altitude after a clear night. She hiked the southeast route in the pre-dawn dark with her headlamp and her good flashlight, the same one she had used on the first morning. The trail was familiar under her boots, in the way things are familiar when you have walked them hundreds of times. She did not need to think about where to put her feet. The mountains did that for you after enough years. Took over the physical work of moving through them so your mind could do something else. Her mind was doing a great deal else. The fallen Sequoia came into view through the trees as the sky lightened. The depression, the exposed root ball, everything as it had been a year ago except smaller in impression than memory. The human mind expands significant places in its storage, and returning to them is always a recalibration. She climbed down the bank and stood at the hatch. The court preservation order had formalized the access process. She had her permit. She had the key to the lock that had replaced Caleb's original seal during the legal proceedings. She unlocked it and pulled the hatch. The exhalation of cold air came up the way it always had, dry and mineral and entirely itself. She descended into the vault. The LED panels she had installed gave it a different quality of light than the flashlight had given it on the first morning. But the room itself was unchanged. The crates labeled with court evidence tags, but still sealed and documented. The workbench with its clear surface, the journal returned to its place after the FBI had finished their analysis. She crossed to the workbench and opened the journal. She read the first entry, then the last. She read several entries in between. The 1936 patent note, the 1939 note about the Sacramento lawyers, the August 1940 entry about Wesley at 8 years old, his mother keeping him in Fresno where the air was better for his lungs. The entry had a quality Marlowe had noticed before and kept noticing. Caleb wrote about Wesley with the restraint of a man who was afraid that saying too much would be too painful to finish. He described Wesley's age and his mother's decisions. He sent what he could. He hoped the boy was stubborn. He had been right about the stubborn. Weston had been stubborn. Weston had walked these mountains for 23 years and refused to leave when easier options existed, and Marlowe had done the same thing. And here they both were, Weston in memory, Marlowe in the present, both of them in the same mountains connected to the same ground, by the same quality of refusal to let go of something that mattered, even when the immediate reasons for holding on had become unclear. She sat on the edge of the workbench for a while. She thought about what Caleb had actually been asking for when he built this vault and sealed the journal and left the instructions for Wesley. Not a miracle, not a guarantee. He had been asking for time. Time for the truth to outlast the people who wanted it buried. Time for whatever came after him, a child, a grandchild, a generation further removed, to find the record and use it. He had asked the mountain for that time, and the mountain had given it, in the form of a root system that grew over a concrete collar and kept it hidden for 8 decades. And then one storm on one night in October had changed the angle of a root ball that had been fixed for centuries. And a ranger had been on the trail early the way rangers were trained to be early after storms, and the record had come back into the light. She closed the journal and left it on the workbench exactly where it belonged. She climbed back up into the October morning. The light was full and clear by the time she reached the surface. The kind of light that comes when a cold night gives way to a cloudless morning, turning the ridge gold from the east before it reaches the valley. She stood at the edge of the depression and looked at the fallen Sequoia, gray now in its second year of beginning to return to the forest, the crown decaying slowly into the understory, the trunk still massive and present, but no longer the living entity it had been. In the cavity where the root ball had stood, small ferns had taken hold in the rich, exposed soil. The ospreys that had nested in the open canopy were gone for the winter, but would be back in spring. Life is not sentimental about the spaces loss creates. It moves into them and begins its work. Marlowe looked at the mountains above the tree line. She looked at the 412 acres of old-growth forest that were formally and legally and on the county record thornland. The same 412 acres Weston had walked. The same acres Caleb had.